Hello, folks. My name is Jim Worthen. The show is Worthen One-on-One. We're here every Monday at 2 o'clock, Wednesday at 5 o'clock, Friday at 7 o'clock on Channel 17. But our larger platform, because that's just, and they're great people, Cox Cable on the South Coast. But you can go, or tell your friends to go to TVSB and look at the demand button, and I always tell the joke, and then you have to go down through all the shows to Worthen One-on-One. I complained about it, and they said, well, it's the alphabet. And I said, I know the alphabet. You still don't have to make me laugh. And then you could go to YouTube and search Worthen One-on-One, and it's right there. So both are great platforms, and they'll be up probably before our show on Monday. My guest tonight is, or today, or whenever it is, my guest is I'd call him a dear friend, somebody I really respect, somebody I've known for at least 26 years. He's a judge for 25, and I met him during his campaign. Brian Hill. How are you, Brian?
I'm very well. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I was kidding with you before that I think this is probably your fifth show, but it's your fifth show in this recent, the last 15 years or so of shows, but you were on my show a couple of times in the previous shows when you were running for office.
I think that's true.
And you always claim that I got you elected.
I do that.
Well, at least one night at a victory party after a couple of glasses of wine.
Well, I think being on the show was a great help. I mean, to be honest, we were laughing about it, but I had an opportunity to speak directly to the voters and to express my thoughts about being a judge and the things I wanted to accomplish. And I think anytime you have that opportunity as a candidate, it's a valuable thing.
Well, we like to provide it, and although my personal bias is to the right of Ronald Reagan and Rush Limbaugh, but that aside, I've had Kathy Murillo on before she was mayor. I've had, what was his name, Jason, who was a city council member that the progressive part of the party voted out, a Democrat. So I'm open to him.
Oh, Jason Dominguez.
Yeah, Jason Dominguez. I'm open to having liberals, progressives, whoever, but for some reason they avoid me. I think they have a problem with intellectual combat. And even then, I wouldn't be in combat with them, but I'd ask tougher questions. Every show starts out, Judge Hill, where were you born? And that confuses so many of my guests. So when I say that, where were you born?
So I was born in Vermont and spent 5 years there. My dad was a high school teacher. And we then moved to California. And they were part of that mass of migration in the 50s and early 60s from the East Coast to the West Coast. So we landed in Santa Maria when I was 5. And I went to elementary school and high school in Santa Maria until I was 15, till my sophomore year in high school. But every summer between the ages of 5 and 15, we'd pack up the 4 kids, dog, cat, and we would go back across the country to Vermont, where we had a little cabin off a lake in northern Vermont, and we'd spend the summer there, and then we'd come back for the school year in September. And so we did that between my ages of 5 and 15. And then at 15, my parents thought they wanted to go back to their roots. So we went back to Vermont for my last 2 years of high school.
Talking about that trip, though, I did that to our homes in Illinois a couple of times. About a decade before you were doing that, there was no air conditioning. The cars got so hot crossing the country.
There's no air conditioning. I can remember, imagine 4 kids, oftentimes a grandmother, dog, cat, my parents, and I can remember being like this, hour on end. But one of the things that I learned to do on those trips was to read. And so even today, I can read in a car. So a lot of people can't read in a car. My wife loves to drive. So she drives and I read when we take trips more than an hour or two. And I feel like I'm in my living room reading a book, and I can do that in a car.
We share so that I hate to bring in my own vignettes, but on one of those trips across the country, I'd had it. We stopped at a gas station. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but we all got out, water, ice, and when they got back in the car, I said, "I'm not going." Well, my parents knew how to handle me. They got in the car and drove away. About 10 minutes later, they came back and they didn't have any more trouble with me.
That's funny. There was an occasion when we left my sister, my younger sister, who was like 7 or 8.
Not on purpose.
Not on purpose, but we left her at the gas station. So we had stopped for gas. Everybody went in to use the bathroom. And then we all got back in the car, a little bit of Home Alone, and we took off. And it was half an hour later that we realized, where's Holly? So we went, oh my gosh. And we got back, and she's on a little wooden chair out in front of this gas station. And my memory of it is it was a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was like just by itself on Route 66. And she's crying, and she was convinced that her parents had left her. And so,
Did you ever forgive them?
Well, she got whatever she wanted to eat at the diner that night. So like 2 milkshakes and a hamburger.
So your dad was a school teacher.
Dad's a school teacher. And so I did my last 2 years of high school in Vermont, and then we came back to California. So I was about ready to start college at the University of Vermont. But my parents couldn't really, it didn't make any sense for me to stay in Vermont when they were coming back to California. I mean, at least that was the view at the time. Looking back, I think, why not? I should have just been in a dorm room and been at the University of Vermont. But they came back to California, so I started junior college at Hancock. Spent 2 years there.
No student debt.
No student debt. No, I think junior college is great, but no student. Yeah, I mean, it really is. No student debt. Spent a year at the University of Hawaii Hilo, which is a school the size of Westmont, and then I finished up at UCSB, and then on to law school.
Well, similar pattern. I went to Oakland City College. It's now Merritt. My classmates were Eldridge Cleaver and.
Really? That's interesting.
And before the Black Panthers, some people blame me for getting them started, but I was liked by the black students, and I went and played pinball, and they place that was mainly blacks, coffee shop across from the school, and they would call me Swivel Hips because. So, where did you go to law school?
So I went to law school at the University of San Francisco, and then
that's not Bolt Hall.
No, not Bolt Hall. It's a
Bolt
private Jesuit school. Actually, I was steered in that direction by the father of the present governor. So William Newsom was a Court of Appeal justice, and I knew some people who knew him, and I was about ready to go to, I had 2 choices. I could have gone to Boston College or University of Denver, and I was so naive about law school that I was picking my law schools based on where they were located. And I thought Denver's nice. I knew Boston. But anyway, I ended up at University of San Francisco, and in large part because of William Newsom. And I can remember Gavin Newsom running around the chambers of his father when he was like 12, 14, something like that.
So you finished there?
So I finished there. I went,
JD.
I got a JD. I went to Sacramento, where I was a research attorney for the Court of Appeal. I won a scholarship after that to study law, and I studied at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, jurisprudence. Spent a year there. And then I came back, and
you kept going to places that are cold and have a lot of snow.
I kind of did, So, but had a great experience in in Edinburgh. I mean, it's a great city and a great university. And I was able to travel all through Europe. So I spent a month in France, month in Italy, month in Germany. Now this was 1984, 85. So I was able to, so I was actually behind the Iron Curtain on several occasions. It's a long story, but I was arrested in Poland.
Lech
Walesa. Yeah, so they were trumped up charges, but I was arrested. They claimed I was that I orchestrated a solidarity demonstration in Krakow, Poland.
You were at it, weren't you?
I was at it. I mean, the timing was such that I got off a train with my buddy, and as soon as we got off the train, we saw people streaming up a hill where on the top of the hill in the old city of Krakow, there's a castle and there's a church. And there was a big solidarity demonstration. So we walked up and we were in the middle of it. And of course we didn't understand anything because it was all in Polish.
You were an anti-communist before you knew you were.
Well, some of these kinds of experiences will turn a liberal, which I was at the time, into a conservative. Because you see the power of the state, you see what the concentration of power in a central government can do to the people, how it can suppress liberties. And it really made me sort of in tune with what our framers were trying to do by dividing power as broadly as possible. And because when you allow for the concentration of power, you increase the likelihood that there's going to be a suppression of liberties.
I quickly want to go to your beautiful wife and your children and what they're doing before we start getting into the separation of power in the judiciary. So when did you meet your wife?
So I met my wife in, I'm going to say 2004. We were married. We lived together for about 5 years, married in 2009. So we've been married. We like to say we've been together for 17 years. So married for 13 or so. And she's great. She had 2 kids. I had 2 kids. And we have 4 combined. And I mean, we've been remarkably lucky because all 4 kids are very successful, doing very well.
Any attorneys?
Yes, both of my kids are attorneys. They both went to Tulane Law, and they're both practicing lawyers. Boy and a girl. And one's in Birmingham, Alabama, and one's in Jacksonville, Florida. So that's the downside. You go to the South to law school, and you go as a single person. You increase the likelihood you're going to meet someone in law at that school, and they did. And both people are from the South, and they've decided to settle in the South. They had a lot of opportunities. Cost of living is lower. And they're both doing extremely well.
Didn't you go back to a graduation about a year ago?
I did, yes. So that was my daughter. So my son graduated in 2014, and my daughter in, it would have been 2020 or 2021, maybe 2021. And but in any event, they're both doing great. And
yeah.
They're off the payroll, as I like to say. And then my wife's kids, I can't forget about
your stepchildren.
I can't not mention them because my stepchildren are wonderful. And I raised one of them like her father. And her father really wasn't completely in the picture. Was barely in the picture. So that's Lexi, and she lives in Dallas, Texas, and she's doing well. And then I have an older stepdaughter. I say older, she's about the same age as my son, who's 35. And I have a stepdaughter who's about the same age. And she's in Germany, and she's an entrepreneur, got a couple of businesses going, owns a restaurant, and is married to a guy who's 6'8", who's the former director of the German National Basketball Association. So he's very successful. And they come out for 2 months or 3 months every year to stay with us and stay in California, get out of the cold German winter.
Yes.
So anyway, they're all 4 are doing great.
When you came back to Santa Maria, you had experience in the district court in Sacramento?
So I worked for the Court of Appeal in Sacramento as a research
State
attorney.
or federal court of appeals?
State Court of Appeal in Sacramento.
Okay.
In the same court that, a lot of the justices on our California Supreme Court worked at that court, including the Chief Justice.
So you get a job in Santa Maria?
So then I come back from Edinburgh, a year in Edinburgh, and there's an opening in the district attorney's office in Santa Maria. So I get the job in Santa Maria. I'm there for about 18 months, and then there's an opening in Santa Barbara, so I decide to move down to Santa Barbara. So I love Santa Maria. I could have stayed in Santa Maria.
You were a prosecutor.
I was a prosecutor for 16 years.
So when you decided to run for the open seat, you didn't take on an incumbent, it was an open seat.
It was an open seat. So Judge Gordon, may rest in peace, he passed probably 2 years ago now. He retired and served out his term, which was a 6-year term. So it's interesting the way it works in California. We have kind of a hybrid system when it comes to Superior Court judges. If a judge serves 6-year terms, set 6-year terms, if a judge retires or say passes during that 6-year term,
the governor makes an appointment.
The appointment goes to the governor. If a judge announces that he's going to serve out the entire 6-year term and retire at the end of that term, then it's an open seat. And so about 80% of the judgeships in California are filled through the appointment process by the governor, and about 20% through an election. So we recently had a judge, I can't remember. Not sure. I mean, I should know this. This is my court. Anyway, there was an open
Staffel. Staffel.
You know, no, it's not Staffel.
Rigaldi or okay.
Anyway, so we have a judge that's retired. Maybe it's Staffel. But anyway, a judge who's retired and will serve out his term. Oh, it's Jim Voice, who's serving out the end of his term, and it's a 6-year term, and then he's retiring. He's still on the bench.
That's the one Foley ran for unopposed.
And he ran unopposed, which is almost unheard of.
Yeah.
I mean, that tells you a lot about his qualifications
yeah.
and the respect that people have for him. And he was a prosecutor for a long time, and was a commissioner. And I think everybody anticipates he's going to be an outstanding judge.
So you're running for office 25 years ago, 26, and in spite of my endorsement of you, you win.
I win.
Yeah, and so you began your Superior Court career. I think at one time you were Chief Justice, presiding Justice, but you most recently have handled high-profile criminal cases. Earlier on, you handled a lot of civil and mixed cases, but
not too many civil cases. But I've been doing criminal almost exclusively, so a lot of criminal cases, and whatever comes down the pike, I handle. So as it happens, I ended up with a lot of pretty high-profile criminal cases.
Have you ever sentenced anyone to death?
Yes.
Once?
So in 2006, there was a guy named Jesse. There was a guy named Joshua Martin Miracle, and he and a co-defendant stabbed the guy 47 times. They thought he was a rat, and it was a gang-related kind of murder. And he represented himself for a while. It becomes a little complicated when you try to represent yourself in a death penalty case, a capital case. But in any event, he got the death penalty, and I was the judge. And he's been on the death row at San Quentin for since about 2008, so maybe 14 years. But within the last 2 months, we heard that he had undergone a hunger strike. I'm not sure why, but had health issues and passed, which a lot of people do on death row. And you have the health care isn't great. Obviously, if you don't have that kind of freedom and liberty that you have on the outside, it takes an impact.
In your criminal cases, often overturned?
I don't think, I've had some lesser cases reversed, maybe a misdemeanor conviction reversed, but I haven't had a big one reversed. I haven't had a murder case reversed or something like that.
Your most recent big case was the Hahn murders?
The Hahn murders.
And the only reason he wasn't, explain why he wasn't sentenced to death.
Well, so the district attorney, Joyce Dudley, announced that she was going to seek death. And then we had the pandemic, and all jury trials got held up. And so at some point in the process, I think the crimes were committed in 2016, and I'm going to say maybe in 2020 or even maybe early in 2021, the district attorney's office and the defense attorneys representing the defendant Pierre Hopsch, reached an agreement that there would be a court trial in front of me in exchange for the people dropping the death penalty. And so I can't really talk too much about it because it's still a case. Appeals, it's still an open case. But that's how the death penalty was taken off the table. I didn't have anything to do with it. It was between the district attorney and the defense attorney.
Incredibly bloody. They butchered a family.
Well, we have to talk about another case. I can't talk about that one.
I was just going to tell the people. I sat in on part of that. An old, more longer than I've known you. I knew him in high school. Checkered past. Hillary Dozier was one of the lead.
The attorneys on both sides. I mean, the really great thing about handling, I don't know high profile, but handling more serious cases is you tend to get more experienced lawyers and really good lawyers. So the lawyers representing the defendant were really good. And the lawyers representing the prosecution were really good.
Hillary was one of them.
Hillary was one. I've known Hillary for a long time.
He retired, but he keeps coming back. The DA's office brings him back on high-profile criminal cases, murder, gangs. That was his specialty.
But there's a reason for that, and he has that experience. But they also, the DA's office, up until maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, was relatively young. So they had a lot of young, less experienced prosecutors. I think today, in 2022, that's no longer the case. So if we had a like crime today, high profile, required an experienced attorney, I don't think they would bring somebody like Ron Zonin or Hillary Dozier back. I think they've got enough experience now where they have enough really good people who are experienced as well.
You've taught constitutional law at the local law school for many years, and you and I have sat and gone through, for our audience, the Constitution, then separated into half and half the Bill of Rights, and it's been very educational. And now we're coming into some high-profile action by the U.S. Supreme Court. But first, in our Constitution, how was the court set up?
Well, Article 3 sets forth the powers of the federal judiciary. It was contemplated at the time of the framing of the Constitution that states would have their own state courts. In fact, those were the only courts that were in existence prior to the ratification of our present Constitution. So we already had lots of state courts. But the federal courts were set up in Article 3, and it would be headed by a Supreme Court. And then Congress was given the power to add to the federal court system as Congress deemed fit, and as the country grew in population, and as there was an increase in federal laws that required adjudication in federal courts. So Congress will pass a law creating additional judgeships. So Congress created the federal courts of appeal, and Congress created the district courts, the trial courts.
One of the controversies today is the 9th District has become so big in population, that's the district we're in California, and so numerically number of judges that it should be split up. But you're telling me that can only be done by the Congress, not by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, only done by the Congress.
Now,
if the Chief Justice and other members of the federal judiciary thought it was important for there to be a split and create a new circuit out of the Ninth Circuit, I think they would make that known. If they thought the administration of justice would be so greatly enhanced by splitting off the Ninth Circuit, I think they would. I'm not in the weeds on the arguments for and against. What I do know is that it's a fairly even split. I mean, not just among people from the outside, like members of Congress, but also from conservatives and liberals within the Ninth Circuit. And other circuits. I mean, they're split on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea.
Till 2016, the Ninth Circuit was the most overturned circuit, and also was the most leftist circuit, according to legal scholars everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And then,
I mean, that's just a statistic, right? They're the circuit that's overturned the most.
But
I mean,
after 2016, Donald Trump appointed several people to the Ninth Circuit, and it seemed to have changed. Maybe new leadership or new input, but it isn't as radically left and crazy as it was when it was being overturned all the time.
I think people don't give Donald Trump enough credit for how he chose his judges. He's not a partisan when it comes to judges, in the sense that, I mean, obviously he was conservative. He was looking for conservative judges, but he wasn't partisan in the sense that he cared about anything else other than getting the best people. So he would defer to the legal scholars on the conservative side, organizations on the conservative side. Just as, if you're a liberal president, and Democratic president, you're gonna look to those organizations. So he did that, and every appointment was an appointment that most conservatives, virtually all of them, said this is a really good appointment. Now, you remember George W. Bush? He appointed his legal affairs secretary, or his friend from Texas, Harriet Miers. And so that's not the kind of thing Donald Trump would have even conceived of doing. George W. Bush is appointing somebody who's a friend and a crony who was not qualified and ended up dropping out. And so, the people, you might not like their judicial philosophies. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and that's fair. You don't have to like them. But he picked people who were extremely bright, extremely competent, capable, and then not cronies like Harriet Miers.
And they're not people out of his background, nor are the other hundreds of judges he appointed. He looked to mainly conservative scholars and conservative bar. Ed Meese headed former Attorney General, headed groups, two different groups that would give him recommendations, and then it was up to him to talk to and make a decision. They didn't say, you have to appoint this person. Sometimes they were surprised, but they were always in the group of, I think one time he had 30 possible judges that he could appoint from a group of 30 people recommended to him.
I mean, I'll give you another example of a Republican president appointing someone who wasn't the consensus pick of the people who know judges and know about their scholarship and know about their judicial philosophies, and that's H.W. Bush, when he appointed a friend of his friend, who was the governor of New Hampshire, Sununu. So Sununu was a friend of George H.W. Bush, and so on the word of Senator Sununu, or Governor Sununu of New Hampshire, Souter was nominated. Now, that's all good. He was a smart guy, but he wasn't what would have been considered the consensus pick of those who were looking for a conservative justice.
Back in my earlier political career, it was traditional that the president looked to the senators in the state that they were going to make an appointment. I mean, Republican presidents looked to Feinstein and Boxer and for their recommendation. That political influence went away with Donald Trump. And
it did, yeah.
And he didn't care about politics.
He didn't care, not with regard to the judiciary. I mean, it was clear. He was just going to go with the people that he trusted to make the best judgment about who was the best candidate. And some of his candidates might not have been a candidate I would have chosen, and they probably are not really in line with the way Donald Trump thinks, but he appointed him because the people around him, the people who he trusted to make good judgments about judges, recommended these folks.
Yeah. Well,
anyway.
In some other show, we'll go through the history of Attorney General Meese. I first met him when he came to Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet as clemency secretary out of the DA's office in Alameda County. And so he's had a long and storied career that's been pretty remarkable. And so that's how the courts are set up. We recently have a draft opinion. Oh, first, who do you think are the best scholars on the court?
Well, I mean, Amy Coney Barrett is a scholar, for sure. She's the most recent appointment of Trump.
She was a law professor and a judge at Notre
she's
Dame.
Very scholarly at Notre Dame, #1 in her class at Notre Dame. I mean, she was a scholar. I don't know that anybody compares with, say, Scalia as a scholar.
Yeah.
I mean, many of the positions he took that were criticized at the time have become the law of the land, and they are the way we look at the Constitution today, whether you're a liberal justice or a conservative justice. I mean, what Roe versus Wade, and we can tie that to Roe versus Wade, at that time in 1973, justices were kind of deciding what they thought was right according to their own moral lights. And when Scalia was nominated, I guess in the mid-'80s or so, by Reagan, he brought a different perspective on how to read the Constitution. And he insisted that you should read the Constitution according to what the Constitution says and what it means. And
you mean words mean something?
That the words mean something. And prior to that time, the justices were kind of just, well, this seems right. This is what we're going to do.
This is what I feel.
And they were doing that. Now, there were conservative decisions and there were liberal decisions. I mean, they were both sides.
Right.
And those decisions were wrong. So Plessy versus Ferguson was wrong in 1896 because we had an equal protection clause that said, no, states can't make distinctions on the basis of race. And yet you had conservative justices, disregarding.
Now, did Brown versus the Board of Education come from
Plessy versus Ferguson, yeah. But Plessy versus Ferguson was incorrectly decided at the time because we had a 14th Amendment that said states don't.
And how long was it? That separate but equal. How
58
long was?
Years. 58 years.
Oh, so overturning a court case isn't something that happens overnight, and many times, Dred Scott and others, it takes a long time to get it overturned and right in our.
That's right. I mean, I just read an article on Roe versus Wade and the possibility that it's going to be overturned by a liberal Yale law professor who's considered the leading constitutional law scholar of this generation. So you haven't heard of him. He's an Indian American, Akil Amir, and very smart. And he just flat out says Roe versus Wade wasn't law. It was wrongly decided.
So Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that.
Yeah, and you don't really want your justices reading into the Constitution things that aren't there. That doesn't build respect for the law. The law means that you have written principles and written rules, and that whether you, as a judge, whether you like the rule, you don't like the rule, you're going to follow the rule, and people can expect that you're going to follow the rule. And judges shouldn't have that kind of free-floating discretion to disregard laws that we personally don't like, or read laws.
Or parts of the Constitution they don't like.
Yeah, exactly.
Alito.
And he, by the way, that scholar and many others who maybe mostly privately, but sometimes publicly, like him, and he'll be castigated for it and criticized by his liberal colleagues. They understand. They're pro-choice. I mean, they would not vote for a law that criminalized abortion. They're openly pro-choice, but they say Roe versus Wade was undecided. And what the general public can't grasp, and it's not explained so well a lot of times by the very top governmental leaders, whether on the Republican or
so
Democratic
this
side.
current Alito draft opinion, and people like Justice Thomas, who has become a pretty good scholar in writing opinions, has nothing to do with abortion, really.
Has nothing to do with abortion. I mean, people want to make it about abortion because the precise issue in front of the court is a Texas criminal abortion statute, or in this case, a Mississippi abortion statute. But it's really about whether this is a right that's found in the Constitution, or even, I mean, the court's gone beyond just rights that are found in the Constitution. They've extended their fundamental rights analysis. They'll find fundamental rights for any liberty interest, any freedom, any activity or action that's deeply rooted in the nation's history or tradition. So even if it's not explicit in the concept in the Constitution, the right to abort and the right to privacy or not, if it's something that historically has been protected by American law and American culture, the court will deem it a fundamental right.
So, yeah, but abortion wasn't.
Never.
It was till 1973. There was only one.
I think at one time every state in the union had a criminal abortion statute,
yeah,
except for maybe one. So let me just explain what I mean. So the court had a case before it dealing with the right to refuse medical treatment, which is basically our informed consent laws. And every state in the union, I think virtually every state in the union throughout our history, had a law that if a doctor put his hands on you or performed a procedure without your consent, even if it was in your best interest, the doctor was prosecuted for battery. That you had a constitutional right to refuse medical treatment. That's not found in the Constitution. However, the court said that this is one of the liberty interests, the right to refuse medical treatment, that historically have been protected within our legal culture and in our society, American society. And therefore will deem it a fundamental right because no state has attempted to interfere with that right to refuse medical treatment. And here are the examples. The examples are that every state in the union makes it criminal for a doctor to put his hands on you or to perform a procedure when you don't give your consent. So
I've seen that on all the TV shows.
Yeah.
The doctor says you have to have this operation But then they have to get a signature, and if it's a minor, they have to get a parent's signature. So that's where it comes from.
That's where it comes from. So the point is that the Supreme Court doesn't take a crabbed reading of fundamental rights. The court is willing to look not only at those rights that are explicitly protected, like the right of free speech, the right of religion, the right to bear arms. Those are explicitly protected. The court has developed a jurisprudence that says we will recognize other rights as long as we can say that throughout American history, these are rights that have been protected, that are deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And we'll call those fundamental rights. And they include such things as the right to refuse medical treatment. And so if a state attempted to force you to undergo a procedure, it would push up against the right to refuse medical treatment. So voluntary vaccination, there were a lot of issues with that.
Masks.
But certainly mandatory vaccinations. No, we've never tried it. We've never done it, except I think one state, one time in our history. Mandatory vaccination pushes up against the fundamental right to refuse medical treatment.
Yeah.
Now, if we're going to have one, it should be debated in the halls of Congress.
That's what we're coming back to in all of this, is that there is a separation between the judicial power, Congress, and the executive power. And my minor scholarship in history is that's all began to get blurred, really since about the time of Roe v. Wade, to late 60s, early 70s, that you couldn't tell exactly where it was separated between the legislature and the judiciary and the executive, and this case really speaks to that.
Well, it does. I mean, you've said a lot in that question. I mean, so we have our sort of fundamental rights jurisprudence, and the court hasn't taken a crabbed view of what are fundamental rights. It's taken a kind of an expansive view. For example, like I said, the right to refuse medical treatment. But one of the things that the court also has done since 1930 up to today is taken a very expansive view of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And as a result, we have the creation of a lot of administrative agencies, which...
Well, wait, that's Congress giving its power to the executive, right?
Is.
Okay.
It is. So the framers' original design was all legislative power is with the Congress, all executive power is with the president, and the power to say what the law is and to resolve disputes is with the judiciary. And what's happened is that Congress has created administrative agencies that can only be placed in the executive branch because they're executing the laws, which gives the president some authority over those administrative agencies. And then Congress has delegated legislative power. So they've given legislative power now to an administrative agency in the executive branch. Well, that in itself violates separation of powers because it was Congress that has the power to legislate, not administrative agencies in the executive branch. Congress's complaint is, well, we don't have the time. Well, do you watch the kinds of hearings that Congress holds? They don't.
Those kind of legislative things gets in the way of campaigning and raising money
and partisan politics, and it happens on both sides. I'm not. I'm not pointing fingers.
We'll see. We'll see next year.
We'll see. What do you mean? What are you thinking?
Well, the Republicans are going to pick up 50 to 70 seats, and then they'll be doing this.
and they'll be doing the same thing. They'll be holding a lot of hearings, and a lot of it will be paid back because they're upset.
And a lot will be a waste of time.
And a lot of it will be a waste of time. And when they really should be focusing on what are we going to do about the border? What are we going to do about inflation? Until we become self-sufficient with solar and windmills, which is maybe 30 years from now, what are we going to do to drive down the high cost of gasoline, which disproportionately hurts the poor.
Oh, it's horrible.
It's horrible. It's
Yeah,
horrible. And you can't just shrug that off as though it doesn't matter. It matters. It matters.
I can't imagine. Hopefully, employers realize it. But can you imagine being a gardener with his truck, and he's charging $100 for this day of gardening, and he has to drive around, and he's putting sometimes $100 of gas in his truck now.
Sure he is.
It's just wiping him out.
Yeah.
And that's...
Well, I tell you, people don't appreciate the impact it has on local government, too. I mean, we have lots of clerks, lots of staff people. They can't afford to live in Santa Barbara. They're commuting from Ventura, from Camarillo, from Santa Maria Lampo,
Right.
and we're losing those people because they can't afford to pay the gas to come to work, and so we're losing them, and so we have a constant stress in our court system on keeping staff.
Well,
Which in turn, you get poor staff. I mean, everybody, you know this, I know this, everybody in an organization is important, right? I mean, I don't care if it's the secretary or the janitor. They're important. And you have a poor secretary or a bad janitor, and it's going to have an impact on how you operate.
want to focus in now on the protection of the papers by the court, and you as a judge at a normal county level. Somebody leaked them. That's a crime. They'll sooner or later find out, and at least that person is either going to be a celebrated leftist attorney or no longer be respected.
Well, I mean, so that issue has been raised. Is it a crime to leak Supreme Court opinions? And I think the consensus view is it's not a crime.
Really?
It's not a crime. Now, when the investigation occurs and they ask folks, as they'll ask every person, every clerk, every secretary, every staff person, did you do this? Do you know who did this? If they lie to the FBI,
Perjury.
then it's a crime.
Yeah.
So that's where they think the criminal prosecutions will occur. But think about how damaging it is. I mean, these are hugely impactful decisions, and if someone leaks that information, it's like insider information, right? Mm-hmm. Antitrust cases, they're decided a particular way. Stocks, it's going to affect the stock market for a particular company or a whole industry, and the upholding or striking down of regulations that are going to affect stock values. And you have that information, and you're leaking that to your friends at Wall Street or to your buddies in financial houses in San Francisco or LA.
Or using it yourself in trading stocks, as we know some
as people do.
Congressmen and senators did.
Yep.
There's going to be this opinion. It looks like it's clear there'll be dissent by at least 3 people, maybe 1 opinion. I would guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, there'll be the majority opinion, the chief's opinion, and the dissent opinion. And the chief,
that would be my guess.
I think the chief will go with the majority in voting, but he'll write his own opinion. And then there'll be the heavenly opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That'll come down too, right? I'm kidding. No.
Well, I mean, I think the dissenting opinion will be the most interesting to read, because in the Casey case, which I think was,
20 years ago,
1992 or something like that, whenever it was, maybe it was more recent. But the Casey decision upheld Roe versus Wade based on stare decisis. Well, we've had it for 30 years, and so we're just going to continue along. Maybe it wasn't correctly decided, but so what? And So it'll be interesting to see what position the more liberal justices take, because it's not really a great argument for not overturning a decision which was clearly wrong.
Well,
So-
I think their fear, and you may want to talk about it a little bit, is that this case not only says that the court found something that wasn't in the Constitution, but really their remedy is the 10th Amendment.
Yeah.
So explain how that...
Well, the fact that the Supreme Court reverses Roe versus Wade doesn't mean that women are going to be unable to get an abortion. It's going to depend upon each state's legislature and how they debate that issue and how they resolve that for themselves. I mean, that's democracy in action. That's the people trying to convince other people within a jurisdiction, within a state, that their point of view is the correct point. That's the whole idea of a self-governing society, that we're able to decide the laws that apply to ourselves. And there's no reason why the people of Massachusetts or California should dictate to the people of Florida or Texas or Mississippi what their laws should be. They're different cultures, and they have different values. And in a pluralistic society, in a society that celebrates diversity, that's the ultimate diversity, that we have different opinions about things. And we ought to be able to have respect for people who have different opinions, even if we disagree with them.
So the probable opinion will not change anything in California.
Not at all.
But what you're saying is they're saying that pro-choice, pro-life Jim Worthen, it's my job to go out and fight to restrict abortions in California, to convince those who think they are valid that there's a life earlier than they're willing to accept, and that life needs to be, that's up to me, the voter, the
That's
pro-life voter,
That's
to
right.
bring people over, or we'll have to live with it if we can't.
Well, I think the view is, I think it's unlikely that things are going to change in California or New York or Massachusetts or state of Washington and state of Oregon. But things are going to change in other states: Utah, Mississippi, Missouri, the flyover states. They're a little more conservative culturally, and they won't necessarily in every one of those states criminalize abortion, but they may make it a lot more difficult to get an abortion. They may push the time frame for making the decision to get an abortion back to 10 weeks or something like that, 2.5 months.
Or
Or
heartbeat, 6 weeks.
or 6 weeks, or they can ban it altogether. And so there's no question that if you want to have an abortion and you're in a state that doesn't permit abortion, there's going to be some hardship. And if that's what you want to do, you're going to have to travel to another state. And that's just there's lots of laws that all of us don't like, that we live with, because we understand that in a democratic society, majority rules, unless you're dealing with something like established fundamental right, one that's deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, or one that's found in the text of the Constitution. Those are our fundamental rights. And we're not going to be making them up out of whole cloth.
Esteemed politician I know said where this will have an effect in states like California is the right of a mother to be or not to be treated as any other medical patient. In other words, full disclosures of what's happening, waiting period, full health, we'll be able to go in, I want an abortion. They'll codify in the state law a full protection, not of the fetus, but of the possible patient. Is that?
Well, so you may be more familiar with the regulations of the abortion procedure in California than I am. In many, many states, they have regulations that require informed consent. They require a waiting period. They require the woman to fully understand the options that are available. Childbirth, adoption, social services, and so on. The options available. So
my understanding is that isn't true.
That's
in
not true in
California.
California. Yeah. Well, in New York, I mean, you can get an abortion right up to the point of birth, 9 months, 8 months, and 30 days, type of thing. So, and that's not likely to change. But in states like, say the purple states, say a state like Wisconsin, okay, or Pennsylvania,
Nevada.
or Nevada. I mean, they may be states that will permit abortions, but have many more regulations of the abortion procedure, and may cut back at the time frame in which you can have an abortion.
And I think a lot of the pro-life people say, well, if she had to see the sonogram, at this time, that would change her decision. And so there's a whole number of moving issues.
It's complicated, isn't it? I mean, if you can put yourself in the shoes of a woman who's been raped. Say it's a 16-year-old. Okay, she's been raped. She didn't know the assailant. It's not date rape, and she had the goal of going on to college and becoming a medical doctor, and she's a top student. And I mean, she has there's always the possibility of adoption, but she's going to have to carry that child to term, and she's dealing with that reality that this is someone who raped her, and maybe she was a virgin, and she's going to have to live with that child. That's tough. Now, it's not impossible, but I think it gives everybody some pause. I think you have to really think about whether you want to have such a law that requires a 16-year-old to
it certainly is an issue that
it's not easy.
It's almost impossible for a man to understand, just as childbirth is. But women are more blessed with common sense and the spirit than the guy says, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, and he gets a call 3 or 4 months later.
I mean,
we're out of time.
It happened quick.
58 minutes and 30 seconds. We'll do it again.
We'll do it again.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.